You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey everyone, before we get started with the interview today, I just want to bring up the fact that the book that is going to be the topic of this interview is actually on sale at Cornell University Press until the 27th of June. It's 50% off with a coupon code, which brings the ebook down to like $18 or something, which is a little silly, but I'm not going to complain. So that's only valid until June 27th. You can also head to the link in the show notes to find out more information. If you're listening to this before June 27th, I hope you feel special because this little 30 seconds is going to go away after that date. Anyway, check it out. It's a good sale. Lots of fantastic things from Cornell University Press, some of which have been the topic of interviews for this podcast and History of the Great War. So go check it out before the 27th and enjoy the interview. Oh, wait, one more thing. This also isn't a paid ad, just for the record. I just like the book. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. Today, I'm joined by Jeff Rutherford, the editor of The German-Soviet War, Combat Operations and Legacies, along with Robert von Meyer, which is published by the Cornell Press and is available on June 15th, 2025, which I now realize is in the past, so it's available right now. There's a link to that book in the show notes if you want to check it out. Thank you for joining me here, Jeff. How's it going today?
It's going pretty well. A little warm, but other than that, doing all right.
It's pretty warm here as well. So we're here to talk about your new book on the German-Soviet War. So what was kind of the genesis of this book, and what were your goals for it?
Well, the idea was Robert's. He is someone who is very passionate about the Second World War and getting research out there. He edited the Global War Studies Journal for a bit. So he was always looking for ways to get new research out about the Second World War. And he asked if I'd be interested in working with him on editing a volume on the German-Soviet War. He felt that there had been a lot of really good scholarship in the past decade or so, and that this would be a good opportunity to bring some of this to a wider reading public. So that was our general idea. You know, with the German-Soviet War, we have a very good idea about the big issues and the general course of events. But there's a lot underneath that still needs to be talked about, discussed, analyzed. So we're trying to, kind of fill in the blanks, pick on topics or issues that haven't been as researched or discussed and try to bring them to a wider public.
One of the items discussed in the book, and is actually part of the title of the first part of the book, is Vernichtungskrieg. So it's the first part of the book is Germany's Vernichtungskrieg, invasion and atrocity. As with all German words, it's fun to say, but I'm assuming that's not why you chose to title one of the book's parts with that word.
No. So the translation is War of Annihilation. And I think this is one of the major issues that sets apart the German-Soviet War from, say, the German war against the West in 1940 or in 1944, that the German war against the Soviet Union was a criminal enterprise from the very get-go, that it was designed to not simply move borders or seize resources, but to simply wipe the Soviet state off of the map. The population was going to either be starved or shot or forced into slave labor. So it's a war that has a very strong ideological and, as we'll see, I think an economic foundation to it that differs from, say, the German war against France, the German war against Belgium, or the UK. So, from my perspective, at least, that everything that follows in that German-Soviet war between 1941 and 1945 is a direct result of the Germans' ideological approach to the war. This attempt to, literally wipe the Soviet Union and it's off the map and decimate its population. So having a section on that, I think, kind of sets up what the whole war is about from the German perspective. And even if, you can say that the ideological aspects change and evolve over time, the real atrocity of 1941 is kind of stains the conflict throughout its entirety.
Yeah, I think I was just recently reading about the experiences, and I think you also talk about this a little bit in the book, or one of the authors does, about Soviet prisoners of war during that first 9 months of the war on the Eastern Front. And it's horrific is the word I would use, probably.
Yeah, and that's one of those, it's probably the most overlooked war crime committed by the Germans. And it's the second largest distinct population group behind that of European Jews that are murdered in great numbers by the Germans. And as you say, right, the majority of it happens in that first 7, 8, 9 months of the war before the Germans realize, hey, we're not winning the war and we need these guys for labor. So policies switch. But yeah, we have a chapter on that. And what's interesting in this chapter by Maris Rowe McCullough is that most of the work we have on German treatment of Soviet POWs is based on German sources, which makes sense. Those are sources that have been available to scholars. Those Soviet prisoners of war who did survive the war and returned to the Soviet Union were then treated as very suspiciously by the state as traitors, allowing themselves to be taken prisoners. So we don't have a ton of sources on them. But Maris has done an excellent job unearthing sources to give us the perspective of these Soviet prisoners of war in the camps. So instead of it being a German top-down approach, we have it from the bottom. And she also kind of moves the chronology along. 41, winter 41, 42 is when we see this mass mortality. She's looking at it 42 and 43. So a different time period. And what she finds is that conditions on the ground are very similar to what they had been even after the Germans changed their policy. But yeah, no, it's an excellent chapter and one that gives us the other side of the hill, so to speak, right? What does it feel like to be, what is the experience of Soviet prisoners of war in this German war of annihilation?
Kind of speaking a little bit about giving a slightly different story than maybe people are used to reading about. The second part of the book is focused on the experiences of peoples that were not from Germany, not from the Soviet Union. So why do you think it's important to showcase those specific stories?
Well, I think it's very hard to understand European history in the 20th century without looking at this larger idea of the threat of communism to Europe and the idea of fascism as rising to meet this challenge. And to get into these other nations that participate in the war, a Romania or an Italy, what their goals were. And I think what the two authors do that we have in the book, what they do is they're able to put the Romanian experience of war or the Italian experience of war into the larger Vernichtungskrieg, into the larger German War of Annihilation. And what does this tell us about how these countries understand the war? So I think it's super important to look at other European nations and their participation in this war. It's important to look at those groups, those individuals that support the Soviet Union as well. We have a chapter on Lend-Lease aircraft. We have a chapter on a Polish army that is raised by the Soviets to fight alongside of them. And I think The German-Soviet War, it's the largest war of the Second World War. It's the most intense. It's massive armies, massive amounts of material. But it's not just the Germans and the Soviets, and that we have so many other groups that are involved with this, and this helps give it its strategic importance in the war. That this is a war fought by other countries, not just for strategic reasons, but for ideological reasons. This plays out in the steps of the Soviet Union in a way it doesn't play out in other parts of Europe during the war.
Yeah, and I know that those kind of like ideological drivers for participation actually also filter down to individuals, right? So it's not just the nations that are sending armies. There's a chapter about Luxembourg, the people from Luxembourg who joined the fighting. And I think those are really interesting stories because you get those small contingents of mostly volunteers from Western Europe that participate in the fighting on the German side.
Yeah, the Luxembourg chapter is a really interesting one because most of the individuals that Nina looks at in the chapter are conscripted. So they're not volunteers, right? That they're considered Volksdeutsche, so that they are conscripted into the army. And these guys have zero interest in fighting in the Soviet Union. They have no idea what's going on when they're sent there. So her chapter is really interesting. She uses, ego sources, so letters and diaries, and these are all problematic in their own ways, memoirs. But she critically approaches them, and you get a really good sense of the bewilderment of these guys who are thrown into this pretty intense theater of war with no real build up to it, right? German soldiers have been getting this propaganda for years about what they're doing. They're just kind of thrown into it. So the way that they try to adjust to the experience that they see, how they understand what's going on around them. And as she shows, some of them do kind of pick up German language and German ideas and German rhetoric about this war, while others maintain a distance. And do their best to maintain their own national identity as from Luxembourg, as opposed to being from Germany. But yeah, it's a really interesting chapter in that, we just have regular individuals, people like you or I, who are just grabbed by the German Reich, sent to the Soviet Union and figure it out.
Yeah, I always think it's interesting when you dive into interesting personal stories like that, especially in a campaign or a conflict as large as the Eastern Front in the Second World War, where so often you're getting higher level top down histories, right? And so it's interesting to dive into this like people out of place kind of stories, like with the people from Luxembourg.
Yeah, definitely. When I teach the war to my students at Xavier, there's no way they can grasp the immensity of this conflict, right? With million-man armies and tens of millions of deaths and casualties. So, getting at that, the experience of the individual allows for a personalization of the war, and gives people a way to understand it, right? Kind of put themselves in that soldier's position.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. It's the ultimate bundle for an unbelievable price. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. Get it and watch Marvel Television's Ironheart on Disney Plus.
I want to build something iconic.
A new season of The Bear on Hulu.
We can make people happy.
And The Epic, a Minecraft movie on Max.
Anything you can imagine is possible.
The Disney Plus Hulu Max bundle. Plans starting at $16.99 a month. All these and more streaming soon. Terms apply. Visit DisneyPlusHuluMaxBundle.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
The final part of the book looks at the last few years of the war and then the years after. Kind of starts in roughly 1943. So what sticks out to you as an important way in which the war changed during those years, especially as it relates to the German concepts or ideology around this sort of war of annihilation or extermination?
What I think happens as we get to the years of German retreat, and we have 3 chapters in the book on German retreats, and I think this is a fairly neglected topic, at least in English. That this is, we so much of the way we think about the German-Soviet War today is still dependent on the memoirs of German generals who fought there that kind of set the parameters.
Every book's got to talk about Guderian.
Right, Guderian, Manstein, right, and they didn't write a lot about when they were losing, right? The focus was on when they were winning. So we have 3 chapters that look at German retreats. And I think one of the important things that I think all 3 of the chapters do is in some way look at how the German army understood the war from an economic perspective. Clearly, ideology marks the way the Germans approached the war in the East. We see that at the very beginning of the war with the mass shootings of Jews and German army participation in this or support of this, and certainly the scorched earth retreats the Germans carry out in the latter years of the war. Right, they're not doing the same thing in France. Right, so ideology matters here. On the other hand, I think it's pretty clear when you look at the records of German armies or corps or divisions that they're really thinking in terms of economics. That there's this attempt that if we can't have these economic resources, we have to ensure the Soviets don't get them as well. So I do think in 1943, we see this switch in which economics becomes an overriding importance for the Germans during these retreats. And I think for the Soviets, again, a super ideological country, right, where Marxist Stalinism is kind of at the root of everything that they do. The 3 chapters that we have looking at the Soviets during the immediate post-war period, they talk about their ideological goals, what they like to do, but reality sets in, right? What can you do? And here, economic pragmatism again becomes much more important. So I think you can make an argument that the German-Soviet War is, perhaps the most ideological war of the Second World War. 2 ideologies that are clashing with one another, but that for both combatants during the actual fighting and the rebuilding of their countries afterwards, economic reality becomes super important as to how they carry out their own policies.
So this is a section where your chapter appears. So I feel like I'm obligated to ask a question about your chapter. But I did have a good one. I think it's a good one. So your chapter is kind of about Army Groups North experiences during the retreat. And I was curious, was there anything unique about Army Group North, specifically as it related to the Baltic nations, that like your Latvia, your Estonia, your Lithuania, kind of during the retreat, like because those peoples had a very different experience, at least in the beginning part of the German invasion, given their antagonism to the Soviet Union, who had just invaded them a year before.
Yeah, definitely. So Estonia, for example, one of the units I've done some work on for another project, it's the 207th Security Division, German Security Division. And by 1943, they have tens of thousands of Estonians that are working with them in one way or another within the division. So the Germans have a much different relationship with Estonians, not as much with Latvians and Lithuanians, though they certainly see them as different from the Soviets. And they also understand that these people are much more likely to support them than they are the Soviets as they come in. The problem that you see, as you go through Army Group North's records, right, from the Army Group all the way down to the division level, is that the German army has become so used to these really destructive retreats that as they go into countries that are seemingly allied to them or at least somewhat favorable to them, they continue the same practices that they've done in Russia proper. So you see order after order. We're no longer in the enemy's country. We can't be doing these types of things. This clearly does not stop the troops who have become habituated to these kind of retreats. And you see that in Bastian Wilhelm's chapter, right? As the German army gets into East Prussia, right? Part of Germany itself, the troops are still using the routines and the practices that they've kind of honed over the previous 2 years. Now the same thing's happening in East Prussia itself.
You told me for 1,000 kilometers to burn everything down, so I'm going to keep burning everything down.
Right. That's exactly it. And even when the army sends out, we got to stop burning stuff down, right? We need these shelters for ourselves, that there's a certain nihilism that has emerged within the ranks of the German army. One soldier wrote something to the effect that there's really nothing that feels as good as burning down a building, right? That you just feel this real power, right? Every man's a little Napoleon burning down his own building. And I think for a German army who has been beaten by 44 and 45, this is a way for soldiers to kind of demonstrate their own fleeting power, right, in the face of a superior enemy.
Yeah, they control whether or not they burn down that house, and
Exactly.
They don't control a lot of other stuff at that point.
Yeah, to the point where they'll ignore their officers and carry out these policies kind of on their own initiative. Yeah.
With the call out to legacies in the title of the book, I don't think the enduring legacy of the Eastern Front is a topic for debate, but kind of which specific legacies were focused on in this book, like sort of in those last couple of chapters?
Well, the last two we have are on the kind of the rebuilding of Smolensk by Travis Gray and the rebuilding of Stalingrad by Ian Garner. And here, Travis takes an approach of, this is what the Soviets kind of want to do, and this is what they're able to do. And looking at the dichotomy between hopes and reality. Ian's chapter looks at how Stalingrad is used as a symbol of sacrifice from which the Soviet Union can kind of continually draw upon as it emerges from the war and, both rebuilds Stalingrad and rebuilds the Soviet Union, and the interplay between the fate of Stalingrad and the country as a whole. So I think when we're looking at legacies here, it's how does the Second World War, how does this German-Soviet war, how do we see it in the geography, both physical geography of cities like Smolensk or Stalingrad, but also kind of in the mental geography of the Soviet leadership, and those people who have a tale of Stalingrad that they want to use in the post-war era.
I bet those two cities have kind of a very different, maybe a different experience, because, Smolensk is occupied by the Germans for a couple of years, right? And of course, Stalingrad for a couple months. And so it's probably quite different.
Yeah, and Stalingrad's never actually completely captured, right? It's a site of ferocious fighting, and the city's absolutely wrecked by the fighting, but the Soviets are victorious there. Whereas Smolensk is a city that suffers under German occupation for almost 3 years. On their way out, the Germans do the same thing there that they do everywhere else where they go when they have the time, right? Extensive demolitions and burnings, destruction of anything that could possibly be used by the Soviets in the post-war era. So they both start at a similar place, but yeah, Stalingrad has that much more symbolic value, and the Soviets have moved back quickly into Stalingrad to get it up and running again.
So you've obviously written quite a bit about the Eastern Front over the years, including this book, including others. Is there an area where you hope to see more research on by you or others in the future that you think could really help us better understand sort of this period of history and these events?
That's a great question. I think there's been, just in the last year, there's been 3 or 4 edited volumes on the German-Soviet War that have come out or are in production and will be out. And what all of them have done is focused on specific issues that have been kind of overlooked in the larger literature. So I think it's that kind of stuff, right? Building block stuff. One of my friends talked about, a mosaic in the greater tile. And, I think one of the things that I really like about this book, is that we look at Romanian policy towards Soviet prisoners of war. There's not a lot of that in English. And it's really useful, right? Because you can put it into context of, all right, what are the Germans doing? We know, based on the work of Grant Howard and others, that the Romanians waged their own ideological war against Ukrainian Jewry. Yet, Romanian policy towards Soviet POWs is very different from what the Germans do. So, how do we understand the way that the various countries are involved in this? Their approach to the war. So I think that's one thing. If we can get these smaller pieces of what's going on. Second thing, and I think this is to me in particular, I think this would be very interesting, is, we look at the German army, as you said, we have a lot of top-down stuff. But in the past 20 years, we've also had a number of studies on divisions. And how German divisions respond to the war, how they fight the war, how they carry out their occupation policies. So we're getting stuff that's much closer to the ground level. If we look at the Soviet side, we have some really excellent operational histories that get at what fronts are doing and armies are doing. We don't have much below the army or corps level. That we don't have these divisional studies. And I think something like this would be super useful for getting at the Red Army, its experiences, how it evolves over the course of the war, what its soldiers, within this specific division, how do they respond to their superiors, how do they respond to the front, what do they do when they move through these devastated areas in that they've just liberated. So I do think a more detailed approach on the Red Army at the local level would be great. I understand this is a question of sources and access to sources. But you asked what I hope for. That would be, I think that
it was an
really
open-ended question.
Yeah.
I wasn't putting limits on it.
Yeah, I think that would really help us fill out the war as a whole.
Well, thank you for joining me here today and providing some insight on the Eastern Front and also your new book.
Well, thanks for having me. I very much appreciate it.